All right, well, welcome to week 2 of individual and social psychology. How did you survive last week? Anyone a little bit stressed, a little bit anxious? We've got one or two people, I think, that are coming in to the course a little bit late, which is not an issue. It's just a matter of just getting in some time and putting in and looking at a few of those things as well. Can I just quickly, if you just want to type your name into the chat, we'll just do a quick roll call. Is there anyone else apart from Kathy that wasn't here last week?
Even I wasn't here last week. I sent you an email for the Zoom ID link.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, so obviously, great, it's sorted out. And apologies for last week. There was a few
That
people.
was completely my mistake.
Yeah, and it was sort of when I was in the start of the lecture, I didn't kind of stop and check emails or anything.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're all good. Well, we won't know, I guess, because the people that can't get in yet might not be on here, but we'll see how we go.
Do I
Sorry.
still put my name down if I'm from the Malcolm That class like yesterday?
Yes, please, Alicia. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll kind of, if attendance doesn't come up or something, obviously just email me, because I've got I'll save all the chats and things like that, so I can search through, have a look at it. All right, can I start with 2 quick questions?
Hi.
Hello.
I also I enrolled this week. I didn't attend the class last week.
Kirandeep?
Yep.
Yeah, no worries. Maybe just we can talk during the breaks when we have some 10-minute breaks, or if you want to hang around at the end, anyone that's sort of new or anyone that feels a little bit lost with it, and we can do a bit of a refresher and just make sure you're kind of on track does that sound okay?
Okay.
All right. I learned a little bit about YouTube. I really panicked because I had 5 views of my lecture on YouTube. But yesterday's class told me apparently because it was embedded or something like that, maybe they were just all pretending that because it was embedded, it doesn't show up on kind of the main pages of view. Any tech people confirm that for me? No blow your cover.
They're full of it.
All right. That's about right.
No, I said they're full of it.
They're full of it? It should still come up, you reckon? All right. So we've got 10 people already said they've watched it on top of 15 yesterday. So that means, there's at least 20 people that are lying if that doesn't work that way. As I said, so this is for the new people too, that I just want to emphasize what I talked about last week. The work is the same. So it doesn't matter, the amount of work we have to get through is the amount of work we have to get through. We've got one less contact hour in person. So like I said last week, that lecture, most of that's just pretty, is just content. So the idea of giving you that earlier is you can watch it, you can pause it, you can go, oh, I'm not sure about that, or maybe I'm really interested in that. And then you can maybe have a little bit of a skip through the textbook, read a little bit on that around it, but you can sort of take your time to get that. But it really is important to assume that you have watched that lecture. Like I said, though, what we'll do in the first hour is we'll go and we'll do a little bit of an interactive flick through it. And it'll mainly be, as I said, how many people got a little bit overwhelmed with the content? In terms of, there's a lot of stuff to know. There's a lot of pages in the textbook.
Yeah, I do. I do get a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, so the first hour of our 3 hours is where I will go through and say, okay, we'll talk about this. So usually what I'll do is to say, look, did anyone get stuck on anything? Is there anything in particular in the lecture that you wanted to sort of slow down, have a little bit of a look in detail? And I'm happy to do that. We can have a chat. But as we flick through the slides, I'll stop on a few things and say, listen, this one here is pretty important. Make sure you know this. So for the people who are worried about the content, this hour is going to be really good to point that out. So I've done that. And by the way, I think just to avoid the confusion, because we've got 2 3-hour learning experience classes, I decided that I'm only going to post one recording, and I'll probably just alternate it between weeks. So the one we did last week together on Friday morning, that's the one that's posted for both the Thursday and the Friday class, because I try to be pretty consistent and cover it. The one for today's class is the Thursday one. So sorry, this week, the Thursday one. So this week's class, I'm recording it, but I probably won't post this one. I'll probably post up what we did yesterday. It's still all the same thing, and it'll give you a feel for it. But just to make sure that if someone's coming back to watch it, don't think they have to watch two different videos. A couple of people thought they had to watch sort of both of those, which would have been about 5.5 hours of work for it as well. All right, so it looks as though we're watching that, which is great. And as I said, we'll make a note of anything you have any trouble with. And by the way, did anyone get stuck on anything in that lecture on measurement and intelligence?
I thought it's mostly in measurement because I'm really bad at stats, and
Yep.
like because it really made me feel really sleepy yesterday when I watched it, and then I can't really catch up the content from intelligence.
Okay.
But I tried my best.
Okay. Yeah. So are you blaming me for the sleepiness and my boring monotone
No.
voice? Or
No, I'm not, but I'm just blaming the stats, those stupid stats.
a lot of people do, so don't feel bad falling asleep to those ones. All right, the people that didn't watch it, as I said, you probably should go back and watch it, and particularly watch the bits that I'm going to focus on as we go through today. One more quick poll, if I can, just to get a feel for something else that was coming up in week 4. Who's picked a journal article for the assignment?
Well, I choose no, but I had a rough idea of which articles should I pick. Like I have 3 articles in my mind at the moment.
Okay. All right. So 3 people I definitely need to have a chat with. The other 8 people, it is due in week 4. What I'm planning to do next week is to try and free up some time in our learning experiences to do a little bit of a consult for that one. So I'd strongly suggest picking one of those 6 articles. If you're sort of struggling with it, you might have had a look at a couple and you go, oh, they look all confusing to me. Have a chat with me and we'll go through. There's probably 1 or 2 I'd probably say, if you're really struggling a little bit, it might be a little bit easier. But remember, the idea of those journal articles is just for me to get a bit of a feel for where you're at. As I said, if you've had a go at the questions, and maybe we'll have a look at that again just to reinforce that so you know where all that stuff is in the assessment tile. But all I want you to be able to get a sense of is how you're going. If you have, what have we got? 5 people have had a look at it. After today's tutorial, learning experiences, I can't say the word tutorial anymore. After today's class, you should have a bit better understanding of how to find some of those things. Remember, first hour, we're just going to reinforce the lecture content, but the learning experiences sometimes will be a follow-up from our last week's lecture. I'm not going to focus on the introduction to psychology part because that's pretty straightforward. Know what psychology is and isn't about, know about those 5 perspectives, our toolbox about how to understand the way people think, feel and behave, psychodynamic, behavioral, humanistic, cognitive, etc., etc. So that's the key thing. But where people probably have a little bit more trouble is the research methods one, which is the chapter 2. And part of that measurement is in chapter 2 as well. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on that. I'm going to do a little Socrative quiz. If you saw on some of the researches, we did a Kahoot last week. Socrative is something that we use quite a bit as well. The nice thing about Socrative is I can set it up for names and I can set it up anonymously, but I like to set it up anonymously when we do some discussions, and that way people can feel free to just put out any answer you want. There's no consequences. Yeah. You know, because if you said something and it's the wrong answer, that would be the end of the world, right? It'd be so horrible. Although that's what I used to think. I'm very much an introvert, so I wouldn't do those sorts of things as well. But it's nice because you can just comment anonymously, have a go at questions, and not feel like you're identified in any way. And I think hopefully that make you feel a little bit more comfortable to contribute than the normal ones. All right, we're going to go back over a couple of those things in a second. All right, so was there anything in the lecture? So we were talking about that. Was there anything in the lecture at all that people sort of thought, oh, I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't quite understand this bit.
Yeah, especially when it comes to like validity, validity, like
Validity, yeah.
yeah, the three types I don't really understand.
Yep. Yeah, anything else? Did anyone get a little bit better sense of some of the issues with measurement, bias? Anyone learn anything?
I would say I understand pretty much about reliability and yeah, like actually also standardization and bias. Like I'm only a little confused in validity.
Okay. Anyone know a little bit more about idiots, imbeciles, and morons? Do you remember that from the lecture? I might stop and pause on that one. All right, let's have a quick chat and we'll go through and we'll talk about a few of the key things. Can you now see my screen? Full screen PowerPoint?
Yes. Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, as I said, so this is a double-barreled one. The measurement, some of this chapter 2. And like I said, I think I said last week, I warned you about this one. It's probably one of the least exciting content-wise, but every area of psychology, that this notion of measurement and reliable, valid measures is really, really important. Intelligence is something that's a really common topic as well. There's a lot of discussion about, assessing intelligence. A lot of jobs that you'll go for they do psychometric assessment, which includes intelligence testing. And oftentimes a lot of organizations do personality testing, which is next week's lecture topic as well. So we will talk about a few of those things. But speaking of intelligence, I don't know if I had this in the recording from previously. Who did the quiz with me last week? The Psychology is Common Sense. Who remembers doing that one? Feel free to let me know you're still alive there. Or... Anyone remember doing it? Yes? Oh, I got a couple of thumbs up. How did you go on that? Is it easy?
Was that the Kahoot we did?
That was the Kahoot. Those true and false questions.
The one that I won.
Yeah. I wouldn't be a good psychologist if I didn't give you feedback on that. So I thought I'd better give you some feedback. But first of all, I'll probably set some context. There was 10 true or false questions. If I knew nothing about psychology, and in fact, maybe if I trained a chimpanzee just to randomly press either a true or false button 10 times and just recorded those and matched them up against the answers, what would a chimpanzee doing? Assuming it doesn't have psychology knowledge and it's just randomly guessing. Any statisticians there? What should you get out of 10?
Roughly 50%.
You should get about 50%, right? Just randomly guessing true or false, even if you actually didn't even look at the questions. So how did we go compared to the chimpanzees? Anyone want to guess? Not so good. So we got 43.1%. So what does that tell us? Remember I said you're all psychologists now. I don't want you to be rote learners and regurgitators. I want you to be thinkers. And that's something I really want to challenge you to do. Think, question, So what does that say? Are we less intelligent than chimpanzees? Or what does it tell us about our psychological processes that we actually get something wrong more than a guess rate? Yeah.
We overanalyze.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this too. And we have lots of inherent things. Like I said, we're extremely complex, our psychology. Simple things, we kind of overestimate how much complex there is to it. But we have these things we're going to talk about later called schemas. We have these mental representations, patterns. We use these thought process called heuristics that help us try to make our way in the world. Sometimes they work really, really well to keep us alive and survive and things like that. But sometimes, yeah, we can actually make them go the wrong way based on, using some of those characteristics as well. So we do have a bit of work to do to catch up with the chimpanzees. I don't want to put you to shame or anything, but the reason I do this one is I did a similar one when I was a psych student like you. I don't want to brag, but what do you think I got out of 10? Or what percentage? Anyone want to guess?
100.
Of course, right? I was close to that. I got 3 out of 10. Does that make you feel any better? I've kind of insulted you by saying
No,
you're
I
not,
just
not as
laughed.
intelligent as a chimpanzee, but
I just
you're
laughed.
substantially more intelligent than me at the same point in your psychology career. So there you go. Oh, if you want some other good news, the Thursday class got 43.0%. So you were 0.1% better as a group than the Thursday class. I don't know if that will make you feel slightly better, but probably not, right? Okay, so just to go through, as I said, I'm going to skim through this. We don't have time to do a full lecture, but if people want to stop and go over anything, make sense of anything, we'll do it. Otherwise, I'm just going to point out some of the key things, some of the important take-homes for 2 reasons. One will be if it's on the exam, I'm going to point out this is the sort of stuff that I'd really focus on for the exam. So make sure you make a note of this as you're going through. Actually, there's a couple of things I'll point out. I think I got a bit over keen yesterday in the recording, and I said a few things that you should know for the exam that you don't actually need to know. I was getting a bit mixed up because I'm running the other intro psych course and we overlap with the same material. But the other thing I'll point out is some things that I think are important to know, not just for this course, but there's some really important sort of concepts as far as, what I said, psychology is really about understanding yourself, understanding other people as well. One of the key things is this notion we've talked about before, and particularly when we talk about personality in next week's class, we love to put people in boxes, who's an introvert, who's an extrovert, we classify people in all sorts of ways. In reality, and this is one of the key themes for this course, we don't differ by types, we differ on a continuum. And if you like your statistics, or if you're a psych student, you'll be doing this with me, most of the things that we measure, and it includes physical things like height and weight, includes psychometric things, intelligence, personality, all sorts of other factors, really follows what we call this normal curve or bell-shaped curve. Yeah. So when we say, oh, who's an extrovert, who's an introvert, and that's the way we do it, right? We say, okay, well, you're an extrovert, you're an introvert. Where are most people? When you look at that.
Middle.
Yeah, most of the people are in the middle. Yeah, we're significantly more similar than we are different, and that goes within all sorts of comparisons you want to make. If you talk about gender differences within gender on just about everything, between genders is actually less than within genders. In other words, when you look at the overlap between those middle bits, we like to polarize society in terms of political affiliation or religious affiliation. It just doesn't work that way. So as psychologists, the real focus and one of the key themes is we want to measure something on a continuum. It's all about, yes, we're unique, we're special, we're all different, but we differ by degrees rather than differ by types and boxes that we go into as well. Yeah, so that's a really important bit. As we said, so the measurement thing, we spent a bit of time on. Measuring some things are really easy, but I can measure someone's height or weight. But if I want to measure somebody's empathy level, how do I actually do that? When it's less observable, it is a little bit more difficult as well. So yeah, the measurement bit I want to talk about before. 4 key things, and pretty much all of those things you'll need to know for the exam. They might not all come up exactly as questions, but yeah, most of these things you'll get asked about as well. We want to be scientific, remember. Yeah, we've got to focus on a few of these. So to go through them, reliability and validity. And again, this is something that it does take a little bit of time to get your head around before. But the key word for reliability, if you listen to the lecture, is about consistency. So am I measuring this thing consistently? Yeah. And I think I use an example. I jump on the scales. I weigh 95 kilos. If I hop back on the scales a minute later, I should still weigh 95 kilos. Yeah. Maybe I weigh, if I've got accurate scales, 95.1, 95.2, you know, somewhere around that. It might not be perfectly consistent, but the more reliable it is, the more consistent those results are. So that's a really, really important process as well. If it's not reliable, it means it's very inconsistent ways of measuring it. And we used a lot of examples for that. One of the ones that I used, I think, coming up, actually was using a tape measure to measure someone's head circumference. Is that a reliable measure of somebody's intelligence? And the first instinct might be go, well, that doesn't sound reliable because it doesn't measure intelligence. Reliability is about consistency. So yeah, well, if the tape measure is pretty accurate, if I put a tape measure around your head over and over, it should pretty much measure the same thing. It's a very accurate, very reliable, consistent measurement. But it's the validity is the part about, does it actually do what it's supposed to do? As far as reliability, you don't have to know tons and tons on this, but basically there's a few different types of reliability. And again, the idea, so this was the idea we talked about before. Yeah, very consistent. If I measure something over and over and the scores are the same every time, reliable test. Yeah. If it's not reliable, it means, yeah, scores will vary. So, you know, if I've got a reliable mid-semester exam, if I give you that test over and over, you should perform about the same, whatever your ability is. If it's unreliable, it might change, you know, independently of what your performance is like. So the types, again, know these techniques generally, or basically know how to identify these, and they're pretty self-explanatory for reliability. The key thing for all of these tests, it's about correlations, and that's what we touched on last week. Does anyone remember what correlations are about?
It's like the relationship.
Yep, relationship between two variables. So we measure two variables and we want to say, is there a relationship between those variables? Do they actually go together? I might measure how many hours of study you do for this course. I might measure your score on the final exam. Would you expect those two things to be related? How much study you put in and how you go on the course?
Yeah.
Hopefully, right? It'd be disheartening if it had any relationship. So we'd expect hopefully what we call the positive relationship. And we'll talk about this in the experience later on, which means that, yeah, if more hours of study would be associated with a higher exam mark, lower hours of study, lower exam mark. If I did a moderate amount of study, I might get a moderate exam mark. So yeah, we can talk about the relationship. If the variables that I'm measuring correlate highly with each other, that's an indication that it's consistent and reliable. And again, these are pretty straightforward, right? Test, retest is exactly as it says. Give people two tests, give people the test, give them the test again, correlate their scores with each other. So if I do really well on the test at time 1, I probably should do really well at time 2, which will give me high reliability. You know, so I got 10 the first time, 10 the second time. I got 7 the first time, 6 or 7 and 7. So they're pretty strongly patterned. If I got 10 the first time and I only got 4 the second time on the exact same test, that's an indication of low reliability. So that's a pretty straightforward one. And all of these are versions of that. The problem with giving someone the same test twice is if you've already seen the questions, it might influence the way you answer it. I'm sure if I gave you 2 tests in a row, you'd probably do better the second time. So the other way we do it is look at alternate forms. So it's not the same test, but it's covering the same concept that we're trying to measure. And hopefully, yeah, they'll both correlate. That's how I actually do the mid-semester exam. So there's a mid-semester exam. And then for anyone that's ill on the day, has a medical certificate, we'll have a deferred exam. They're different exams, but they're still about the same things we're learning, just slightly different questions. Usually I'll correlate the deferred exam with the actual exam just to make sure the correlation's pretty high. And I know that both of those tests are pretty reliable at measuring it. Doesn't mean they're good tests, but it just means they're reliable. The one that is used quite a lot is called the split half, as we said before. And it's basically, I don't want to write two tests. I know there's problems if I use the same test twice. So let's just have one test. I want to measure your empathy. I've got 20 questions that try to tap into empathy. And then what I do is just basically look at the first 10 questions, look at the second 10 questions, and see if they relate to each other. So if it's a reliable test, the way I answer the first 10 questions should be pretty much exactly the same way I answer the second 10 questions. So that's a nice, neat one when you've only got one measure as a way of checking reliability as well. Yeah. Some things we don't measure with surveys. So some things rely on actually people observing and recording behavior. But as we said, the big problem's bias for that. If I know what I'm looking for, it's very easy to see what you want to see. So what we can do is get multiple raters to actually do it. Did I talk about MasterChef or something in the recording?
Yeah, you did.
I might have to, I have to update it to the new judges, I guess, shouldn't I? But yeah, basically the same thing. So yeah, all the judges give it 9 out of 10. That's a pretty reliable rating. If they all give it 3 out of 10, it's pretty reliable. But if one gives it a 9, one gives it a 3, one gives it a 5, well, those ratings aren't very reliable. And again, they all give it 9 out of 10. Does that mean it's a really good dish? Not necessarily, right? So validity, so remember reliability, the key word to look for is consistency in the measurement. Validity, is it actually measuring what I'm trying to measure? So reliability is necessary, but that's not sufficient to be a good measure. It also has to be a valid measure as well. It measures what it's supposed to measure. And again, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So like I said before, measuring someone's head circumference with a tape measure would be very, very reliable, but does head size indicate intelligence? Most likely not. So it's not a very valid measure. It doesn't really measure intelligence, even though it's very reliably measures just how big your head is. Although I think I said in the lecture, there was a few exceptions to that, right? There's some things about brain size and cognitive decline in age, and some people have found some kind of weird correlations for that. Yeah, so Rainbow mentioned the fact that, these were a little bit tricky. They are tricky for a multiple choice, and I think I said in the lecture, because they all start with C. So if you go, oh, what's that one starting with C? You do have to know these 3 types for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. So these will be 3 choices in a multiple choice with something weird thrown in probably. So we have to be able to identify which ones are which. So let's go through those really quickly. Construct validity. The key thing for construct validity, does my test correlate with existing measures? Yeah, so I've got an anxiety test that I want to do. I've come up with this new measure of anxiety. And when we talk about constructs, this is an important thing. Constructs are the concepts that I'm interested in. So I might be interested in anxiety. I might be interested in empathy, which is great. But if I want to actually do some scientific research on this, I have to have a way of what psychologists would call operationalizing my variable. In other words, turn that construct I'm interested in, that concept, into a measurable variable, something that I can measure people's variation in. So in other words, I'm interested in anxiety, but how do I actually measure your anxiety? Do I give you a survey with questions in it? Do I measure cortisol levels in your blood as, an indication of stress? When I'm talking about validity, that's the idea, is do these measures actually measure what I'm supposed to measure? So construct, the key thing to do is, well, there's lots of existing tests on anxiety that are nice and reliable and valid. Run my test, correlate it with an existing scale. This is an intelligence example, but if my test correlates, then it's a good indication that it actually is measuring anxiety, because those existing measures it correlates highly with. And what I might do, I think I said in the lecture too, I might also correlate it with a depression test or some other sorts of things. and hopefully it doesn't correlate as strongly with the depression as it does with the anxiety. Because then I know, well, it's not just a measure of just, you know, poor mental health. It's actually specifically measuring anxiety itself, if it correlates with anxiety measures, but not with depression measures. So yeah, construct, does it overlap with other measures as well? Content's pretty simple. Does the content of this test, does it capture all the aspects? And we're actually, and by the way, I think I mentioned for the people who weren't here last week, we're not doing an intelligence test today. Because there'd be some legal implications with the Australian Psych Society about the test, but we are doing a cognitive ability assessment, which is very similar to an intelligence test. I think I mentioned that last week, right? I've got to be careful with my words. So if I call it an intelligence test, just ignore me. If I just said, okay, I want to see if you're intelligent or not, I'm going to give you a maths test. Is a math score and a maths test, does that capture what intelligence is about? Yeah, definitely not, right? So the idea of content validity, does it really capture everything that should be in that? Yeah, so if I want to measure just general anxiety, I don't want to ask you questions on, have you got a fear of snakes or spiders? Yeah, that really doesn't capture overall anxiety. It probably measures more something about anxiety or a specific phobia towards something as well. So content is about, does it measure all the aspects of what I'm trying to capture with my construct? Criterion's a fairly straightforward one as well. Criterion, the other term for criterion validity is sometimes called predictive validity. So the key thing for criterion validity is, does it correlate with outcome measures that we'd expect it to predict? And if anyone watched the lecture, when we talked about intelligence tests and where they were originally used, and maybe in your experience where you've come across them, what's probably one of the key predictions of intelligence tests? This will be a little test. One of my classes, I actually do a Kahoot on the lecture. I'm thinking about maybe introducing that. So when you say, yes, I watched the lecture, I can actually test and find out how much you actually watched of it. Do you remember? Has anyone come up? So yeah, if we're measuring IQ, like intelligence tests, where are they commonly used? Anyone remember doing one as a kid?
Schools, like in primary school, the
Yeah.
standardized tests.
Yep, perfect. So, and this is worth knowing too for the exam. Yeah, one of the key criterion validity aspects, if I'm measuring intelligence, particularly if it's a school-age child, does it actually predict success at school? It might be a really reliable measure. It seems to correlate, it measures intelligence, but if it doesn't predict anything useful, then what's the point of doing it? The whole idea, if I give this child an intelligence test, I can identify, you know, is this child maybe needing some learning support, or maybe is this child, you know, need to be pushed maybe into an advanced program? Yeah. So yeah, success at school is one that probably the key prediction we'd use for intelligence for criterion. So we okay with that? Reliability is about consistency of the measurement. Validity is about, does it measure what it's supposed to measure? Yeah. Construct validity, does my test correlate with other measures that are trying to measure the same thing? Content validity, does it measure all the aspects of what I'm trying to measure? And criterion validity, does it actually predict something useful, an outcome that's actually relevant to my measure? Yeah. Rainbow, you made that comment before, is that
Much better.
a little bit better? Yeah, as I said, just the more you go over it, the better it'll be. But if you haven't watched the lecture, this is probably going to be, you know, pretty quick. So what's standardization? Yeah, is standardization important? Yes, absolutely. There's some really, really important things for standardization. If we want to compare people, and I use the example, if you get 4 out of 10 on the first assignment, how did you go? Well, objectively, maybe it's a fail, but does that mean you did really badly? this is a little bit like if you standardize your score of 43% against mine, if the average was 3 out of 10 and you got 43%, well, that's actually pretty good. Yeah, if everyone got about 2.5 on average, 2 or 3 out of 10, then 4 out of 10 is actually good relative to the rest of it. So if I want to compare your performance, standardization is really, really important. You don't need to know lots about this. As I said, this is just a bit of an introduction for things that go later on as well, because we do a lot of stuff in stats on that. The nice thing about it is most physical characteristics, psychometric data, lots of things in the world do take this nice bell shape, this continuum where most of the people in the middle. We use this little thing called the empirical rule that says basically if we know what the average is and we know what a standard deviation is, and you don't need to know too much about that, but it's a measure of how spread out the scores are. If the standard deviation is really big, it just means that there's a lot of variability in the scores. If the standard deviation is really small, it tells me, well, most people are very close to it. But we know usually about 2/3 of the people are within about 1 standard deviation away from the mean. 95% of people within 3 and 99% of people, 95% within 2, 99% within about 3 standard deviations. So as I said, this is a really nice way we apply it, because when we do an IQ test, every IQ test might have a different score. So someone might measure IQ out of 50, someone might measure out of 200. The scores could all be different, but the idea of standardization is, well, my test is out of 50. I got 42.3. What we do with standardization, I'll say in a sec, is we give everyone the test, we get the average. If the average for everyone that I'm being compared to was 42.3 and I got 42.3, I'd actually be standardized to have an IQ of exactly 100. Yeah. And we also, to make it easy to interpret, we standardize the standard deviation as well. So most IQ tests get a mean of 100. Who's heard the IQ, like if you're 100, you're on the average? Doesn't mean you scored 100 on that test, but you've standardized your score to that. The standard deviation is 15. So we know if you do an IQ test, 68% of people should fall within 85 and 115, one lot of 15 either side. 95% should be within 2 lots of 15, so 30 below 70, 30 above 130. And the nice thing about that is we can identify, well, okay, well, if you've got a score of 115, we know half the people are below 100, 68% are within 2. So yeah, I'm about the 84th percentile. So there's only 16% above. If I score 130 or more than 130, well, 95% of people are between 70 and 130. So only 2.5% of people are more than 130. Only 2.5% of people are less than 70. So I know if I score above 130, well, that's very, very gifted as far as intelligence goes.
Is the
Yeah,
IQ test still like a done thing? Sorry.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Who's that, Laurie?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we still do that. In fact, if you go for lots and lots of organizations do it, although a lot of organizations now focus a little bit more on personality. But I know if you want to get a job in like the police force or a lot of other things, they'll do a lot of that psychometric testing. It's still used in schools quite a lot.
I did one at school.
Yeah, sometimes it used to be, they used to sort of, everyone did one, and they wanted to get a kind of a measure of it. Now it's probably scarcer resources for schools. Usually it's a teacher might identify a child and saying, this child looks as though they're quite gifted, or it might be someone that seems to be this child struggling a little bit. So we'll do some assessments, they'll do a bit of a workup, and part of that usually would be measuring intelligence as well.
Is it normal to drop as you get older? Because I don't think I'd do as well as what I did in school.
In theory, you once you get to sort of adulthood, you don't change too much. Once you get to about 16, 17, you don't change too much. But yeah, there might be some truth in that. I suspect mine's been on the slow decline for quite a while now.
Because when I originally did it in grade 10, I would have got 124.
Yeah.
There's no way I could get that now. No way.
Yeah. It depends. And again, there's a lot of debate and argument. I touched on that a little bit in the lecture. We'll come to that when we get to the intelligence bit in a sec. But yeah, in theory, it should be fairly consistent. if it's a proper standardized test, but some different styles of intelligence tests measure slightly different things.
Okay.
So some people do better on one than the other. Yeah, but yeah, possibly. It's a really good question though. All right, so yeah, standardization, as I said, is really, really important. So just a quick review of standardization. Know what standardization, they probably think, you don't need to know lots and lots of detail on this, but know what standardization does and doesn't involve, because that's the sort of thing I might ask you about. So just to go over the key things, we want to basically, obviously measure that person's performance, but then we want to give that same test to a random sample from the population. And that's a really, really important part of standardization. If it's not a random sample, then I don't have a population I can compare it to. So we don't ever want to give it to what we call a convenience sample. So if anyone's done any pollings where people put polls on Facebook or something, vote now, those would be called unscientific polls. They're not worth very much at all, because you can't generalize to the population, because one, you've got to be actually on Facebook. Two, you've actually got to be bothered actually voting on that poll. So if we want to do true scientific polling, we can't just go, oh, put something up and can you help us out and vote for it? We have to get a random sample from the population, select those people randomly and contact those people and get them to participate. That's a really important bit. So yeah, give a random sample to the population, but definitely not a convenient sample where it's just whoever I can get. Find out the average performance for that population, and then obviously comparing your score to the average performance is what standardization is about. So if you go back and have a look at a little bit of that in the slides, you'll see some important stuff. Maybe just read about that process, about what it does and doesn't involve. But I will ask you something about what does, or what standardization does or does not involve, all those things as well. Bias is a super important topic. Anytime we measure it, and I gave that example in class. Yeah, how many people knew how many nickels are in a quarter that watched the video? Anyone know that? Some people are familiar with American currency.
They're like 5 cents, aren't
They're
they?
5 cents, so and a quarter is 25 cents. So yeah, there's 5 of them. That's a really, really important topic. And as a general commentary, like psychology, we talked about in the history last week, has developed through Western psychology. So there's a lot of inherent bias in the way that tests are run sometimes and scored. We might talk about some examples of that. I'm going to do a little bit of stuff when we're doing our, not intelligence, cognitive ability test this afternoon. This morning, and I'm going to give you the results next week. I'll talk about a bit of that when we look at the results, but bias is a really, really difficult one to get around. And like I said last week, we're all biased. Anyone that says, oh, I'm very objective, I'm not biased, I'm not judgmental. Humans are designed to be that way. Hopefully you're not letting that, the key thing, I guess, is being aware of those potential biases so that you can actually hopefully prevent those biases from influencing your behavior and decision making as well. But it's very difficult because we're intuitively set up to make judgments, decisions, using mental shortcuts and things like that as well. So yeah, we know that when we do some of this testing, there is some bias as well. And again, I'm not going to talk too much about that as well. All right, so yeah, that was basically the measurement stuff. Reliability, know your different types of validity, know a bit about the process of standardization, and yeah, just generally know that, the potential for bias is inherent in all of those tests. If I can, I've actually got a Kahoot with, if anyone's heard of it, it's actually mentioned in the textbook called the Curie IQ test, which is a test on Indigenous Australian culture. And it's things that most people would not know, just to show you that, that if you were from a different culture, there's a lot of things that are a little bit difficult. I've got a few English as second language people here, right? One of the tests that we're going to do in a little bit involves a language component. Yeah, I know, and this is something that I'm going to talk about, there's probably a very inherent bias there. If I'm asking you about vocabulary and language, if English is not your first language, then I'd expect that you may not do as well. Would I then say, oh, it's because you're less intelligent? Well, no, it's because I know about the bias in the test, if that makes sense. So that's an important thing as well. Intelligence, yeah, so very broad definitions of intelligence. So there's lots and lots of definitions I talked about. I think I might have said in the lecture, Sternberg, who's one of the people I'm going to talk about in a sec, has one that I like, which was just, it's simple one, the capacity for goal-directed adaptive behavior. So it takes into account the fact that there's some sort of, you know, problem-solving adaptive nature to intelligence. And it's about not necessarily demonstrating, but it's the capacity to demonstrate it. So yeah, it's the, not necessarily, intelligence doesn't mean you've done these things. It means you have the ability. That's one of the important things of identifying intelligence with good tests. Sometimes people might not have access to, you know, the same level of education, the same level of resources as well. But the intelligence tests, if they're good, should be able to identify someone's capacity for learning and to do well, even though they might not be at the moment. So that's an important one as well. 2 schools of thought, just briefly. We're going to actually test this afternoon because I've got 2 different types of tests we're going to do together. And by the way, is anyone a little bit nervous about doing intelligence testing? It's not a great test, and obviously it's kind of the Aldi version of intelligence tests. It's sort of the budget cut price one, but it's one that I can just share freely. It's not a restricted test or anything like that. But there's 2 different parts. So originally we sort of thought, well, people that are good at one thing are good at everything. But yeah, if you add maths to the equation, that might rule out, you know, a big proportion of people if you said it was general. But there's a general trend for it. We're more leaning towards what Gardner talks about, is this notion of there's not really a general intelligence. There's more about just there's lots of different aspects of intelligence. So if we want to measure intelligence, we should try to capture multiple different types of intelligence as well. And I'll show you some evidence of that. So yeah, we talk about this G factor or general, or a S or a specific factor. I'm not going to ask you specifically about, you know, people's names specifically, and particularly any intelligence test where there's lots of factors. Oh, briefly, I will mention this because this is a useful one, and with what we're going to do this today. Fluid intelligence and crystallized is a nice distinction that Horn and Cattell made. Fluid intelligence is, a lot of people talk about as what we call a culture-free test. If we want to try and avoid biases from language or existing learning, you know, people that have just exposed to more education, read more books, more general knowledge, if we give a fluid intelligence test, hopefully we can pick up someone's capacity to learn and not be biased by, you know, cultural influences and environmental influences.
Yeah, sorry, Tony. Can I just interrupt a little while? Because does fluid intelligence also mean like information processing?
It could be, yeah. Yeah, information processing, we come into that, as long as it's not based on existing knowledge things. Crystallize, yeah, is that basically something that's been part of a learning process. So knowledge, you know, reading, experience in the world. Crystallize, we'd expect would maybe increase as we get older because we learn more things. Whereas fluid intelligence is the one that's probably a little bit more consistent. And to give you an example, as I said, one of the, yep, sorry.
Like why I said it might be information processing for the fluid intelligence is because like lifespan has touched on this, and I thought like culture-free task, is it like pretty relevant to information processing?
Yeah, definitely. The Ravens, this test here is one that's considered a pure test. I know that the police used to use this one. So, you know, looking at just the way you process information as well. Yeah, don't worry about Cattell Horn. One thing I will ask you maybe a question about, know the Sternberg's triarchic theory. It's a nice, simple one, and I think it's a good one because analytical intelligence is kind of what covers what most of what we do as an intelligence. But Sternberg said, you know, that people have really great ideas, have creative ways of looking at the world, good imagination. You know, that's a form of intelligence too, that creative we should look at. And the one that, yeah, I'm okay at analytical, as I said in the lecture. Practical intelligence, I'm not very good. But that's a really important component as well. If we think of intelligence as our, you know, adapt, survive, you know, evolutionary speaking, that street smarts over book smarts. So practical intelligence is something he focused on as well, which I really like, that nice little model. The other very influential one is by Howard Gardner. Basically, you know, he looked at all these multiple ones. And by the way, just in case you need to know this, he looked at visual spatial, and we're going to try and measure a type of visual spatial in our test we do, as well as a more of a linguistic one. So these are the kind of two I'm going to test today, or you're going to do the test on. Visual spatial is a bit more like that fluid intelligence. Yeah, but Gardner was great. He talked about, you know, really broad things. So yes, I might not be, you know, academically smart, but people have musical ability. People have this kinesthetic, you know, dancers and athletes, you know, you'd say that's an intelligence, right? It's very adaptive, helps them to achieve goals. Existential intelligence, I like, you know, you being able to use intuition, all those sorts of things as well. This one too, yeah, so the arguments for Gardner's, as I said, there's three really nice, straightforward sorts of arguments. We now know with some of the biological psychology research that different parts of the brain are associated with different types of intelligence. So there's sort of, I won't go into that. That's something we do in 1001. We know that kids aren't born at 5 years old, they're great at algebra, you know, but 5-year-olds are pretty good socially, right? So they have some social intelligence. They know how to interact. They know how to start manipulating parents pretty early. So because these different types of intelligence differ at different ages and develop differently, that's pretty good evidence that it's not the same thing being developed. It must be different intelligences. And I'll show you a video of this next week. You haven't seen it. Stephen Wilshire is what we call an autistic savant. So he's on the autistic spectrum. He's got autistic spectrum disorder, which is a very, very common thing. And again, this is that nice thing of now with modern psychology. It used to be, oh, you're autistic, you're not autistic. Well, everyone's on the autistic spectrum. Some people are very, very low. You know, some people are higher on it. He's very reasonably high on it. So if you gave him a normal intelligence test, he would do poorly, but incredible artistic skill, photographic memory for images. Yeah, really, really amazing. You might have come across some YouTubes of him before. I might give you an easy question on emotional intelligence. There was a big push in the sort of 90s, early 2000s on this notion, IQ is overblown. Yeah, being book smart, it doesn't predict anything. And there was some evidence for that it's not overly good. So there was a big push. Daniel Goleman was one of the key researchers in that. That was sort of saying, yeah, emotional intelligence, you know, having self-awareness, being able to regulate your emotions, particularly having empathy, being able to have good interpersonal skills. That's a form of intelligence that's really important to measure as well. And in fact, he saw that a lot of organizations moved away from intelligence testing to try to tap into this emotional intelligence, because it seemed to do have pretty decent criterion validity. What was that again? Criterion validity? Help me out here. Like I said, you don't have to call answers out or type them out, but hopefully at least something's ticking over in your head when I pause for questions. By the way, some people feel bad if I sit there in silence, but I'm pretty comfortable with it. Yeah, maybe an easy question on that. Some of the measurements of it, don't worry too much about that. You can look at it and read through it. Like I said before, yeah. So if you watch the lecture, did I talk about in the lecture recording about idiots, imbeciles, and morons? They were actually statistically defined terms depending on what percentile you were on intelligence tests. So they weren't just broad insults. They were actually, did I talk about that in the lecture? Do you remember that? I think I did. It's usually what a lot of people remember, even though it's not important to know for it as well. Yeah, idiot's the worst, I think. Imbeciles better, and morons are the more higher functioning. But for me, that's a bit weird because moron sounds like a bigger insult than idiot. All right, I've got some basic tests. Again, you don't have to know the inside out of these tests, but this is something just to get you familiar with the way we do it. The WAIS, just quickly, the Stanford Binet is something that's used quite a lot in the US and a few other places. In Australia, more commonly than not, clinical psychologists will use, and educational psychologists will use the WAIS, the Wechsler Older Intelligence Scale. This is a pretty comprehensive test. school-age children, they have what's called the WIS5, and for the primary school, they do the WIPSI. Yeah, so those are probably one of the more common ones, depending on your age as well. Gives you a full-scale IQ that you can, standardize to 100, but it also measures verbal comprehension, working memory, perceptual processing, speed of processing. So it breaks it down to some subscales. A lot of those ones, particularly when they're used on the WISC, look at different aspects. So some kids might, have some deficits only in particular areas to focus on as well. Yeah, so I'm not going to ask you anything about the tests themselves. I have some memories of in doing honours in psychology and having to actually do a WACE on a participant and getting video recorded, and you actually got graded on making sure you were kept to the script and you were scoring it properly. So it makes me nervous looking at a few of these questions. Yeah, in terms of reliability is usually pretty good for intelligence tests, pretty strong correlations. Validity though, as I said, yeah, one of the key predictors is success in school. But in some cases, it's not overly good depending on the type of test, as we said before. And I think I mentioned in the lecture, it seems to be better at predicting how long you stay at school for rather than how well you go at school in some cases as well. Yeah, so there's lots of good arguments for doing psychometric assessments like intelligence testing, but there's lots of arguments against it. Yeah, and again, like I said, it minimizes, most of the intelligence tests measure that analytical intelligence. So it minimizes creativity, that emotional intelligence, practical experience and knowledge as well. Yeah, and again, some of them don't measure, as I said, they measure more crystallized intelligence, what you know, rather than the ability to know something if you're exposed to it as well. Potential biases, labeling as well, that happens quite a bit. And that's one of the big problems with schools and things like that. I'm not sure if I talked about in the lecture, but I was talking about yesterday an example of a child that had performed low on a test and that was needing learning support. So a psych just came in, external educational psychologist, and just went, right, sit down, kid, do this test. Scored the test, all goes into a computer. So there's a lot of computer scoring stuff on it. Spits out a report saying, oh, this kid's on, this lower percentile, recommend learning support. The teachers were like, that doesn't really gel with us. Parents are saying, no, it doesn't seem like to gel with us. So they got reassessed and they ended up sort of interviewing, talking about what was happening. The kid was actually at his cousin's place till about midnight the night before, got pretty much no sleep, didn't have much breakfast. So again, people can sometimes use this number on a score to make decisions without actually knowing the basis behind that as well, knowing history.
This happened at my sister-in-law's school.
I did?
Yeah, she, well, not this exact, they did the NAPLAN
Similar
testing.
thing.
There was this little boy and he just guessed everything. Did really well on the NAPLAN testing, so he didn't get the school didn't get funding for him. And they're like, he was actually needed help. He was just completely guessed everything.
Yeah.
And then the teachers, people higher up, no, you don't need anything for him. And the teachers are going, you can't.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you flip a coin 10 times, every now and then you might get 10 heads in a row. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with the coin. Yeah. So, there's variability around performances on that. And it potentially then, if people make decisions on it, we'll talk about personality testing next week. People make some crazy decisions based on some psychometric testing. It's, I'm pretty sure I didn't talk about NAPLAN in the lecture. I try to avoid that topic if I'm being recorded. The concept of things like NAPLAN, intelligence testing, I think are really good, and there's some really important uses for it. But it's a tool as one of a lot of tools at trying to get an assessment. But to use a number on its own and make decisions on it sometimes, it's crazy. Another one I remember of a child that was performing, it was behavioural issues that the child was in trouble for. Not paying attention, disrupting in class and things like that. So someone actually came in, they'll talk about observational studies. Someone came in and actually sat in the classroom and noticed that the child was kind of leaning forward, squinting a bit. And they sort of, they then said to the parents, has your child had an eye test? And as it turns out, they just needed glasses. They couldn't see the board. They couldn't read anything. And obviously getting frustrated. So obviously if you can't read anything or see anything, you're not going to pay attention. Went to an optometrist, whacked a pair of glasses on the child, and it was chalk and cheese in terms of their behavior. They stopped all that stuff. But people focused on, that's, one particular thing without sort of using this as one of a number of sort of ranges to work it out. Yeah, but it's interesting, I said, yeah. So I don't want to talk too much about that anymore. Lots of stuff. All right, one quick thing that I will ask you about is the nature-nurture debate. So just to go over that really quickly. Correlations, closer to 1, the stronger the relationship. The key thing is identical twins that share 100% genetic similarity have very strong correlations. So there seems to be a pretty strong genetic link. And I think we're up to about, maybe there's 60, this is not causal, it's just correlational, but about 56 to 60 genes now have been identified that seem to correlate with aspects of intelligence. So there seems to be a pretty strong in some of the more recent genomic research, particularly when you look at, well, fraternal twins are 50% genetically similar. So they've still got genetic similarity as a weaker correlation. But if I raise identical twins apart, they're more similar than what fraternal twins are raised in the same environment.
So that's been tested.
Yeah, lots and lots of
twins
studies.
and like raised them apart.
Oh, it wouldn't, yeah, not as an yeah. So this is not as a true experiment where they're randomly assigned and they've got 20 sets of twins. You stay together, you live at home, all right, you two, you're off. Yeah, but actually by circumstance.
Okay.
So if you're an identical twin, psychologists love you. Yeah, if you're an adopted identical twin and you're adopted out or something, then that's even rarer. So they're sort of highly prized. Yeah. So this is just by circumstance. So again, there's potential confounding variables in that as well. So the wash up is, really quickly, and we'll have a break in 2 secs. Sorry, I went a little bit over what I wanted to. About 50% of the variability in intelligence seems to be just basically genetic, heritable. Yeah. So yeah, 50% you could probably control. Yeah. So what I want you to know is that genes and environment. So out of, identical twins raised together, identical twins raised apart, fraternal twins raised together, fraternal twins raised apart, what would the genetic and the environment think? So if it was 100% genetic, who would be most similar?
Identical.
Yeah, and it wouldn't matter where they're raised together or apart, right? If it's 100% genetic, just identical twins. If it was 100% environment, all nurture rather than nature, just reared together, it wouldn't matter whether they're identical or fraternal. So know that kind of thing. I'll ask you something similar to that as well. And I think I said in the lecture, by the way, happiness is pretty similar to intelligence. Who's got a goal of being happy in life? I said last week, well-being is a better term than happiness. About 50% of our well-being, our happiness, overall sort of levels of happiness, seems to be pretty much genetic set point. Like we all have set points for our, weight or intelligence or any of those sorts of factors. There's a bit of wiggle room around the outside. 40% is in about our control. 10% is life circumstances. Yeah, so if you're waiting for that lotto win or the nice new car or something, that might give you a 10% leeway around your set point, but 90% of what's going to make you happy doesn't have anything to do with what happens in your life. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Oh, sorry, one more. Creativity. So just know your 4 types: fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. I will definitely ask you a question on this, and it might be there's those 4 names are your multiple choice options, and it might say someone that has the most responses would be highest in, and you have to pick one of those. Or it might say flexibility could best be described as, and it gives you the definitions as your 4 options in the multiple choice. So yeah, that's the key one. Fluency is pretty easy. It's just the most responses. Elaboration is really easy. It's just how detailed the responses are. And this is a little test giving circles. The one that probably is a little bit more confusing is flexibility versus originality. Flexibility is that within your own individual responses, they're quite different from each other. That's flexibility in your responses. Originality is your responses compared to what other people would be doing on the same task. So originality is, yeah, like Darlene, not many kids drew a bomb. Maybe we should get Darlene in and maybe do a bit of an assessment. It's unusual, you know, for a 6-year-old kid maybe to be drawing bombs with circles whenever all the other kids are drawing faces, but you never know, right? Does that make sense? All right, let's have a quick break and we'll come back. As I said, I've got some practice stuff on last week's one. That was probably a bit more than I want to normally talk about in the lecture, but I thought because a few people hadn't watched it, I'll go over in a little bit more detail. How many people, for the people that did watch that lecture, how many people have got a little bit more of a conceptual link here? As I said, if you did, great. If not, make some notes on the things I said are worth knowing about so you can come back and look at those things and focus on those. All right, let's come back in 10. Sorry, just while we're having the break, who wanted to look at the journal articles? How many people are interested in looking at that?
Me, please.
And me as well.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, so we did go over this last week a little bit. Can you see the website?
Yeah.
Okay, so on the assessment page,
Yeah. Assessment.
oh, what's happened there?
Oh,
Look at a dodgy link on that. Has anyone clicked on the assessment and it's not worked? Oh no.
It worked for me.
Yeah, no, it must have just been, I did something weird then. So all the assessment items are in separate pages. You can go through and flick the pages over, or you can use the little contents here. So yeah, that first assignment, as I said, if you look at it, you might get it go, oh gosh, I don't know how to understand these articles. The word limit's a bit arbitrary. You shouldn't even, some people go, oh, I only did 200 words. Does that mean it's no good? Probably not. You could do this really quickly. So as I said, it's due at the end of week 4. The articles you pick from are these ones here. So yeah, this one here, we're going to talk about experiments and quasi-experiments and correlational designs. This one here is a little experiment on different types of meditation. And I think look at how that influences your sense of connectedness. Some of these, Maslow's, if you're picking, Maslow's my favorite person, but this is a terrible article. You can pick that one, but if you do, you probably need some help with it because it's really messy and they didn't really find any significant results. Yeah, it was a bit of a dog's breakfast, that report. But you can still pick it and have a look at it. As I said, it's not, which one you pick is not going to influence your mark. Candy and tipping is an experiment as well. One of the nice simple correlations is social media and heavy drinking. There's 2 terms there. They're both the key variables. So this is a nice simple correlation that matches up So there's quite a bit of statistics in it and a bit of research, but it's the results and the predictions are pretty simple for that one. It's just talking about, is there a relationship between those two variables, etc. But yeah, pick one of those. As I said, maybe the simpler one is, I don't want to influence you, I really shouldn't say that, but that's a pretty nice simple one. And we are doing correlation in the 30% assignment. The key thing is in the guidelines, basically there's 6 questions here that you need to go through. The first one is the only thing that I'm expecting APA for. So all you need to do is whichever article you've picked. So if I go back and I say, I picked social media and heavy drinking, it's got the title of the article. It's got the journal article, which is Psychological Reports. It's got the year, it's got the volume number and the page numbers. It's got a DOI there, and it's got the authors' names here, but you have to turn that into an APA report. So you need to go to oh, it's org.au, isn't it? Go to Redbook. You know, go to referencing, go to reference list. How do I reference a, can you still see that? Is it flicked over to the new browser?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. So go to journal article. Okay. So I put the surname, then I put a comma, then I put the initial, and if there's a second initial, put that initial. Do that for the authors. Then I can use an ampersand rather than AND. Year in brackets, then the title, then the journal title, italicized and capitalized, volume number italicized, then the issue if it's in there, then the page. And you probably should add in there the DOI at the end of that as well. So yeah, that's the only thing you need to do in APA. And then basically, yeah, what's the research question? Are there specific hypotheses? I'm going to go over this again next week. So if anyone's coming back from a break and going, oh, am I missing something important? I'll redo this too. Main variables, this will make a bit more sense after we talk about some dependent variables today. Who participated in the study, what they had to do. That's a pretty straightforward one. The participants part of our method. And we'll do that with we'll do a little participant section for our prac that we're doing we're doing later on this morning. What are the results? And again, sometimes the results section isn't the best place to find results, because in the results section, it's full of statistics and graphs and all sorts of weird stuff. Sometimes the start of the discussion section is a better place, because in the discussion, you restate the results, but you don't use stats and numbers. You just explain it in words. And by the way, variables, sometimes if there's graphs in there or figures or tables, you know, that's a good indication because they're labeled usually with the variables on them. Limitations, most of these mention their own limitations. So you can basically do that. But what I don't want you to do is copy bits out of that journal article. What I want you to do is put it in your own words if you can. As I said, if you've had a genuine attempt, you might have some APA errors. You know, you might get the IV and the DV mixed up, the dependent variables. If it's, as long as you've answered all the questions and have a reasonable go at it, you'll score well on this. I don't mark this hard. So yeah, that's all you need to do for it. As I said, this has to be an APA, but you could just put 2 and then just put some dot points. You could do a little paragraph answering the question, but you don't, I'm not looking at presentation, grammar, APA writing, apart from just giving you a bit of practice and making sure you know at least how to do a journal article reference for it as well. But you don't have to do any in-text referencing or anything like that with your answers. Just whack your answers in. You know, you can put IV equals and then write the name of it, DV equals. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be anything. And as I said with that note, some of these articles, you look at it and you go, oh my God, I can't understand any of this article. I'm going to fail this course. And in fact, I really focus on this now because I think I lost a few people that started that assignment and went, oh, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. Yeah, if you feel that way, have a chat to me. Trust me. We're going to work. Some of this will make a bit more sense after the next hour, but we'll work our way through that anyway. Does that help a little bit? And there's a submission link in there. So what you do by the end of week 4, click on that submission link, drag your Word doc in, your file in, and with your answers to your questions.
Tony,
Makes it. Yes.
is this an essay like we have to write introduction, body? And
No. It's just that the major 30% report is title, page, and abstract, and introduction and method, results, discussion, references, all those sorts of lab report things. This is just purely, I just want to get a feel for, can you identify, what the main questions are, the variables, some of the method sections, some of the results. So it's just purely about just demonstrating you got a bit of an idea about understanding that article. Yeah.
Okay. Now
some of them go into more detail. So one of them, I think, there's 6 hypotheses for maybe it's the academic motivation one. Some of the hypotheses are really complex. You don't even need to worry about those. Just focus on some of the main ones for it.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
And the pattern of the assessment would be like, do we mention the question first and then answer of it, or we just write the answer straight?
Sorry, say that again.
So do we need to mention the question as well in the assessment, or just the answer?
Oh, yeah, if you can, yeah. I know some people do it as like a big essay, and it's all in there. It's if you just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's probably good. You don't have to retype the whole question.
Okay.
But if you've numbered it so I can go, there's your answer to this, 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 and this, just to make it a bit easier to find it all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. As I said, this is just for me to get a bit of a feel for where you're at, what your understanding level is. And it's really then I can identify, some people do a fantastic job and be really, really good. And I know I don't have to worry about them as much for the 30% assignment. But for the people that have struggled with this, I know, okay, you're probably going to get a few more emails from me, just to make sure we do a bit more scaffolding for that 30% assignment, because this is not going to affect your mark much. It's the 30% that's going to be the make or break for sure. All right, just quickly, what I'm going to do, just for some practice on what we did last week, as I said, I'm not going to talk about the chapter 1 stuff. You can go back and look at that in the lecture. But if we jump on Socrative, there's a link on the portal in the resources section, but I've just posted in the chat the link to it. I'm going to do some practice questions together, and we're going to sort of talk about a few of these key things to do with designs. And we will use this Socrative to collect some data for our cognitive ability assessments in a second as well. I'll make it anonymous. Okay, so yeah, could people found that link?
Yeah.
All right. I'll share that screen so you can see it. By the way, I've got these questions we're doing on Socrative. I've got these as questions and answers on the learning experiences slides that after class today, I'll post all these up. And anything that we do in class, that if I've shown you PowerPoints or I've gone through, I'll have some slides for you that you can always come back and have a look at it. So here we go. I'm running an experiment. So this is, remember, we're making the distinction between some of those experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, and correlational designs from last week. I'm running an experiment. It's okay, it's an experiment. What were those conditions for an experiment we need to know from last week? Looking at a newly developed drug on cognitive performance. So my independent variable, the one that's independent, free to vary, or free for me to manipulate, and we're going to practice doing some IVs and DVs in a sec as well, is the drug. If I'm running an experiment, the independent variable is easy to identify because it's always the groups I'm comparing. In an experiment, the dependent variable, and this goes for a quasi-experiment, by the way, as well, the dependent variable is always the measured variable, something I can measure numerically on a scale. Yeah. So if it's in groups, it'll be the independent variable in an experiment. If it's measured, it's a scale score, it'll be the dependent variable. So I've got 100 participants. 50 participants get the drug, 50 participants get the placebo, which is good, right? Because if I just gave someone a drug and said, here, take this, and I'm going to measure your performance, I might get what we call that placebo effect. The fact that you think you're taking something, you might concentrate more, you know, you might focus a little bit more. So what I want to do is have that placebo group. So 2 randomly assigned groups get this white pill. In a blind experiment, which is the way that I want to run it, neither participant knows who gets the pill. So you don't know whether you've got a pill with just sugar in it, a placebo, an inactive one, or you've got the drug in it, which is great. If I do a really good experiment, I'll actually have what's called a double blind procedure. And not only do the participants not know whether they've taken the drug or not, the researcher doesn't know either. So they take a drug, it's just coded up, and it's not until all the results are in that the experimenter then gets to know who actually got what. So there's no potential bias for the experimenter to sort of see what they want to see. So why am I silly here? What have I done wrong? So this actually isn't a true experiment. I've said I'm running an experiment, but it's not a true experiment. Oh yeah, sorry. So for the first one, I probably should explain that. The control placebo, yeah, that's the no drug condition. Look at the results. People that took my drug, much higher cognitive performance than people that didn't. So surely I've proved my drug worked.
Yeah, because people who arrive early are generally smarter.
Yeah, so what's missing that makes this not a true experiment?
If you were to give like each person, like every second person, the other drug, you'd probably have a better result.
Yeah, so what are the conditions that we need for an experiment? So yes, we need to manipulate the independent variable, which we've done. You know, we've got a drug versus a placebo. Hopefully we've controlled for potential you know, variables that might influence it. We've done it, made the conditions the same for both groups. But there's one really important thing that I need to do for an experiment. Got the word random in it. That ring any bells? People had a look through chapter 2. Is random assignment ring any bells? The idea is, yeah, I've got to make sure, because some people might have high cognitive performance, some people might have low before I get into the test. If all the people that take the drug are, you know, better cognitively, then I'm not testing the drug, I'm just measuring that. So by random assignment, what I do is, yeah, I get 100 people and I randomly assign 50 people into each of those 2 conditions. And then that ensures that if there's any existing differences, they should be equally spread between the groups. So yeah, so the next question is what a lot of people got on there as well. What differences could exist between the people that showed up early and showed up late that could influence the DV? Would people want to jot down a couple of answers for that? Or call it out, you don't have to type it in. If it, as I said, this is more so people can type in anonymously if they want to contribute, the introverted people. What might be different that might explain it? So this is what potentially what we're looking for here is what's called a confounding variable. So this is a variable that, you know, it changes with the dependent variable, it also changes with the independent variable. State of calm, yeah. So who would be calmer? People that are on time, not running late, maybe. Yeah.
Probably I would say that the ones on time will be better because maybe they can come here in advance, or at least they're not in a rush. But the later ones might be like they're just running out of time and just they're really
intelligence. Yeah, maybe, you know, all the smart people know they should be on time, right, and show up early. One of the ones I talk about in the slides when I post them up is motivation. You know, more motivated people might show up early for the test. And if they're more motivated, then they might concentrate more and do better than the test. People that show up late might have less motivation, so they might not try as hard on the test. So there's lots of factors that might influence that. But yeah, it's missing random assignment. All right, what about this one? I want to know, is there a difference between psychology students and engineering students in social skills? You're doing a psychology course with me. So I promise you at the end of this course, your social skills will be amazing.
Mm.
Actually, no, Amy should be saying that about interpersonal skills, right? That's her bread and butter. What's the issue here?
Maybe they're the people who simply.
Yeah, so again, sometimes like that first example, there was no random assignment because that was poor procedure on my part. I could have easily randomly assigned people when they showed up. And yeah, as Josh said, you know, you show up, you get the drug, next person gets the other one, and do it as randomly as possible. Sometimes I can't run a true experiment. That one I could run a true experiment as long as I just randomly assign people to drugs. This one, I probably couldn't run a true experiment because can I get 100 people and say, right, you're off to study psychology, you're off to study engineering, and randomly assign people to those courses? Ethically, maybe I could in theory, but ethically it probably wouldn't be a good thing, right, to tell someone what degree they should be studying. So in this case, yes, it would be very difficult to run an experiment. And again, because I can't assign people randomly these conditions, I can't manipulate whether you study psychology or not. All I can do is measure it. That's when it becomes what we call a quasi-experiment. So it's still like an experiment. I'm still comparing groups. I've still got a measured dependent variable on social competence. But in this case, yeah, if I find a difference when I run these quasi-experiments, it's potentially a lot of confounding variables. There's no way to know that maybe, you know, how many people are interested in social things? If you put the social work psychology people here, what's the most likely explanation, which I've got in this one here? People have talked about it before. Yeah, psychology students obviously might already have higher social skills. That's why they're interested in psychology. So in fact, I'm not measuring anything to do with this studying psychology. I might be just measuring those bars on that graph just represent existing differences. My course hasn't changed anything. That's just what they were before. How do we get around that? Because that's something that I might want to run an experiment for. And I'm not going to go into too much details on that, but this is what we call a between subjects design, or sometimes called an independent groups, where different people are in the different groups I'm comparing. The other way I can approach experiments is to do what we call a within subjects design. And we'll do some of these this course where the same person is measured more than once. So instead what I might do, measure the social confidence of people doing psychology. Then they do the course, and then after the course is completed, then I measure their social competence again. So it's not a foolproof method, but that's one way we could do is what we call within subjects. So each participant is actually measured on both groups I want to compare. And it's usually kind of before and after the intervention where you do those sorts of things as well. Yeah, so social skill knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I want to, last one too. This is an important one for correlations for our assignment. I've run a correlation, so I've measured a child's reading ability. It's the dependent variable, because obviously that's what I want to predict. That's the outcome, the measured variable. But the key thing that's different between correlational design and the experiment and quasi-experiments, the independent variable is also a measured variable. So I'm not manipulating groups. I've actually got two measured variables, and I want to see how they correlate, how they go with each other. So number of books I've measured, and then reading ability. Is how many books in a child home a good predictor? I know, you know, if you...
No, definitely not.
Reading ability?
No, because it doesn't mean that they have increased motivation, like there's no relationship between each other.
Yes. So the key problem with correlations is, yeah, well, if you want to answer that question for me, can we say that if I provide books, this is my correlation. So I found, yes, there is a strong positive correlation. The more books in a child's home, the higher the child's reading ability is.
No,
Can
you
I
can't
say
say
then
that.
yes, if I provide additional books, will that improve their reading ability? Yes or no?
I mean, it could be possible, but there should be some like requirements or just some conditions in between in order to like possibly make the motivation increase to like improve the child's reading ability.
Yeah. Does anyone want to guess this? I've only got 7 answers here. No?
It depends on their age as well,
It's
though.
anonymous. Yeah. So
What age
it
are these
makes
kids?
sense, right? And sometimes, and this is, sorry, Laurie, you know?
Oh no, go on.
No, this is the problem with correlation. And again, if you want to get an extra mark out of 30 on your assignment, this is the key limitation because we're doing correlational research. And by the way, I'll tell you this about a dozen times over the next 6 or 7 weeks. And I really get depressed every time I mark the 30% assignment because there's usually like about 3 people that actually remember to talk about this. But when it's a correlation, we don't know that there's actually a causal link between those variables. There might be, but we don't know. And correlation doesn't allow that. Experimentation is the only way we can establish true cause and effect. Yeah, and by the way, what I should ask is, well, do you read to your child? That would probably be a better predictor. Why might I not ask that question?
Because it depends, like it can or can't happen.
Because
do you
people can
do you
lie.
read to your child? How much do you read to your child?
People will lie about it.
Yeah. Or as a psychologist, we might be a bit more diplomatic and would say there's a potential social desirability bias in their responses. But you're right, people do lie, right? That's pretty transparent. People aren't going to go, people know that reading to a child, that's pretty common knowledge, is good. So yeah, people probably go, yeah. So yeah, measuring something's a little bit, maybe not as directly linked, but might be a predictor, might be a way of trying to do that without upsetting the parent or asking them to, putting them in a situation where they feel like they're uncomfortable or have to lie or something like that. But yeah, just because there's a correlation doesn't mean that's the case. Correlation between my X and my Y variables. Well, it may be true that yes, more books will cause child's reading ability. So that's a potential possibility. And that, yeah, we actually are right. Maybe we've got it the wrong way around. They're correlated because it's actually the reading ability that's causing the books. My eldest child, it was probably more evidence for me that it was the other way around. I've got my independent-dependent mixed up. She just loved to read, and just wanted books, always wanted more books. Can we buy more books? So yeah, it was actually the reading ability that was probably driving the number of books. So maybe that's a potential possibility. And in some cases, maybe there's an external variable that we haven't even measured that's the real cause of both of those things happening together. That's common when we have things called spurious correlations. And I might have talked about that a little bit in the lecture if you watched it from week 1. Did I use the example of ice creams and drownings?
Yeah.
We can do the statistics, and there's a strong correlation between ice cream sales and drownings at the beach. I can predict accurately, and it's good. Correlation is very good for prediction. So I can predict that the more ice creams are sold, the more drownings. Yeah. So does that mean that the kids are getting ice creams, stomach cramps, and drowning because they're not listening to mum or dad's advice? You got to wait 40 minutes right after you eat. Yeah. Or maybe it's the other way around. The drownings are causing the ice cream. Oh, my kid just drowned. I'll buy myself an ice cream to cheer myself up. Probably unlikely, but in that case, there's a third variable, which is, temperature, number of people. If there's more people around, obviously sales are going to go up for ice creams, but more people in the water, more chance of drowning. So yeah, correlation it doesn't mean there's no causation, but it just means we can't test for sure whether there's a causal link or not. That's a really important limitation of correlation as well. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Now, just quickly, we'll do some practice. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, so don't sort of get too caught up in them, but I will give you the practice. This is just identifying designs, IVs, DVs, and things like that. And this, as I said, this is more to give you a little bit of help for the journal article. So I'm interested in studying the effects of a new versus old cognitive behavioral treatment program on anxiety. Patients who experience anxiety randomly assigned to either the new or the old treatment group. Anxiety is measured at the completion of the program. So variables that might have an impact on the results. Controlled for ensuring that start of the treatment, the groups are equivalent. So would this be an experiment, a quasi-experiment, or a correlational study? Again, don't stress too much. Have a go at this. Remember, it's all anonymous. So if you're not answering, practice guessing. Five seconds.
By the way, I sometimes get a little confused between experiment and quasi-experiment because they both have like, I mean, they are like they can have multiple groups to be controlled.
Yep. That's why we're practicing these. Yeah. Correlation we should be able to rule out. Why can we rule out correlation from what we just talked about? What does the experiments and quasi-experiments have for their independent variable that's not in the correlation? Any words stand out? Groups. So if I see groups, remember the correlation, both variables are measured variables. You know, reading ability, number of books, hours of study, exam mark. In this case, there's groups. So does it meet the conditions? Well, in this case, we've controlled for some of the extra variables. We've got random assignment to the conditions. We've manipulated the IV. Yeah, that's set up pretty much for an experiment. So on that, it's still the same question, all the same details as before. What's our dependent variable in this case? Again, have a quick go at this. I want to push through this to make sure we go through a few and get a break before we... I don't want you to be tired for your cognitive ability assessments. You're going to really enjoy it, trust me. So much fun doing intelligence tests. Actually, some people enjoy it. Some people like that sort of stuff, the challenge.
Yeah, I think it gets me more, like it gets me to think more.
Maybe, do I need to call a rollout? Maybe some people have actually gone out for a walk, watching Netflix or something. Maybe I have to put some names on it. I can do names, but just not show them on the screen. Keep them anonymous. Yeah, so anxiety, the treatment program, which leads to which? So what's the cause? What's the effect? Is the treatment affecting the anxiety, or is the anxiety affecting the treatment? Which depends on which. Does anxiety depend on? Yeah, so anxiety is dependent.
On, yeah.
We think it will. This new treatment program might influence your anxiety. It'll be better than the old one. So yeah, anxiety is the dependent variable. So obviously, what's my independent variable?
Treatment program.
Yep. Oh, not quite. Age is something we measured, but are we really, and this is something that I wanted to point out, when you're reading the journal articles, there's key variables that we're interested in and we hypothesize, but we do also measure a lot of other variables. We always tend to get demographic data, so we might measure gender, although one of the studies, I think gender was a variable people looked at for the statistics one, were there differences between males and females. But in most cases, things like age and gender, some of those variables we measure, but they're not our focal variables that we're interested in. Yeah. And how many groups were there for the treatment? Sorry, I don't have the chat showing. Have I got some? Oh, I got people in the chat. So the levels or conditions is just the groups. So I just want to make that distinction, because when you're reading journal articles, some people call the groups conditions, some people call them levels, some people call them groups. It all means the same thing. It's just the different ways, those categorical ways the independent variable varies. Yeah, so in this case, 2 levels, there's 2 groups are comparing the new treatment versus the old treatment. All right, let's do another quick practice one. So organizational psychologists interested in how levels of stress affect illness rates in the workplace. Employees are divided into low, medium, and high groups based on the level of stress they report on a questionnaire. The frequency of illness over the past 12 months is also assessed. So is this an experiment, a quasi-experiment, or a correlational study? Sorry, can you hear that crow at all coming through my mind?
I do. Like,
It was mine.
oh,
it's
the crows are
going-
so annoying.
I don't know what's going on. There must be a cat or something.
Like the
Yeah.
crows are always super duper noisy outside my home, because my home is just like full of trees around, like in my complex. It's just like a forest.
Yeah. Are there groups in this one? Yes. So in this case, yeah. If the people that take correlational study, I usually get a few people. It's probably what we should do, right? Because we measured stress. If we measured someone's stress on a stress scale, and we measured the frequency of illness, then why didn't we just run a correlation? We probably could, but in this case, they used that measured variable, but then divided the people into low, medium, and high groups. So in that case, yeah. So this is a quasi experiment. Why is it quasi rather than experiment? Did they get randomly assigned to those stress groups? No, so we didn't manipulate that. They were assigned based on their existing levels. So again, potentially there's some confounding variables there with it as well. What's our DV, our dependent variable? So remember what's our outcome variable? And by the way, there's a really key thing here. If you see the word affect or influences, the IV always affects the DV for this one. So in this case, yeah, the dependent variable, we want to know whether stress affects illness. So we think illness is affected by its dependent on your level of stress. Does that make sense? So as I said, you can go back over there.
But when you said at the end of the sentence, like the frequency of illness over the past 12 months is also assessed, that means, is there something that is also being assessed?
Yeah, so that's our dependent variable. That's how we're finding out. So we say, yes, stress does affect illness rate. So how do we define, remember this is our construct of stress and illness. Okay, how do we define stress? Well, we give people a questionnaire and we divide them into either low stress, medium or high based on how they score on that test. So that's how those groups are assigned. Because we've not manipulated stress and made you high, low or medium stress and randomly assigned you to those manipulations, then it's a quasi. And then, yeah, when we say illness, well, we've just looked at how much you've been ill over the past 12 months. So we might measure the number of sick days you've taken from work or something like that, if that makes sense. So our IV, our independent variable in this case would be, don't get mad at me for this one if you get it wrong. This is a teaching moment too. Who's good at multiple choice? The mid-trimester's 40 multiple choice. The final exam's got a big chunk of multiple choice in it.
I stress myself out so much over multiple choice. It's ridiculous.
That's why I've added now, I didn't have this last trimester, but I've added lots of quiz questions.
Thank you so much.
This is my little test. Oh, a couple of people got it. What's the rule for multiple choice? When you get an answer and you go, yep, that looks right, tick it, but make sure you can go through and rule the other ones out as wrong and go, well, yeah, no, anxiety is definitely not part of this study at all. Illness, that's my dependent variable. Stress group, oh, hang on, I've got stress level, I've got stress group. Yeah, so how many people went, yeah, stress is my IV without thinking that through? And it was the reason I had that as the first option. I hid this one down the bottom.
Yeah, I've chosen stress level.
And again, this isn't designed to upset. Like I said, don't get mad at me about this. This is just to give you a little heads up, remember, about some strategies we need for some of the assessment. This is nothing, right? It doesn't matter you get this right or wrong now. This is about trying to get some learning that helps us when we actually do have to do the assessable bits.
Yeah, but I still don't really understand why, like, what's the difference between stress level and stress group?
Well, because we've divided people into those three groups and they're the groups we're comparing, then stress group is the independent variable because it's a quasi experiment.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
Yeah. Stress level, if we did a correlation between stress level and illness, then stress level would be it. And it's a bit of a weird one. Yeah, so how many levels for this one? In other words, levels, remember, groups are the same thing. Again, this is a bit of a practice. You should be able to think this one through. Yeah, there's 3 levels. Remember, illness was not the independent variable, it was the dependent variable. So I threw that one in there as well. All right, good. Any questions or comments on that? Trust me, if you don't get this bit, you'll be fine. Obviously, yeah, you do need to try and identify variables, but that's what I'm here for. As I said, that 5%er, I don't care whether you get everything perfect, whether you don't. And in fact, it's probably not going to influence your mark that much. What I do care about is at least you've had a go at answering those questions in that 5%er. It's a mark out of 10, I think I said, by the way, too, you'll get, only because Turnitin doesn't do half marks. And I don't want to give people just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I want to give you sort of halves if I need to. But as long as you've had a crack at those questions, you'll find. And what I said, pick your article, put something together, flick me an email and just send me an email saying, look, Tony, I've just had a quick, and again, don't get away from this thing that like, you've got to have a really, really good draft to send to me, or you've got to really know what you're talking about to ask questions. Send me something with some really basic stuff in it, whatever you've got, and say, look, am I on the right track here? And I'm more than happy to give you feedback for it. Like I said, you know, and I probably didn't talk about this enough last week, particularly for a lot of people that might have, you know, this might be their first experience at tertiary education. I really expect you to take responsibility for your learning. You know, I do sometimes, you know, I do get invested and I want you to do well. So I do sometimes, you'll get some annoying emails and saying, you haven't come to class, is everything okay? Or, and things like that. But really, there's not much point me, you know, just saying, you know, have you done this? Have you done this? You know why you're here. You've got your goals. Like I said, I'm here to get you to meet your goals. So please, 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 don't just disappear on me. Don't go, oh, it's getting a bit too hard. Please, please just flick me an email, have a chat. Just let me know where you're at so I can work out some strategies to get you there. If you're prepared to work hard at this, like I said. So yeah, you could get some of this stuff wrong, but as long as you've tried to answer those questions in that 5%, and you've been showing up to class, the majority of you will probably get 5 out of 5 anyway for it. Yeah. It's only if you just don't answer a question or you don't even try to put something in APA or those sorts of things as well. So this is more just for me to get a feel for where you're at. But trust me, you can get through 4 years of psychology, you can get through PhDs and still not really get what the stats are about and research methods. there's plenty of people that, you know, that this just is a real struggle for. But it's not a barrier. It's just something we just got to make sure that we do enough to make sure we get through and we're okay with it. All right, let's take questions. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll do some exciting cognitive ability assessments. This is going to be a bit weird because normally what I do is give you a booklet and you answer the questions and then we score it. So it might be a little bit tricky to do this online, but we'll do the best we can with it. By the way, if you want to stay logged into Socrative, I'll ask you, because I'm going to analyze this data, do some results and write it up and give you an example of the sorts of things we'll be doing in our 30% assignment. So if you stay logged into Socrative, I'll ask you once we do the test and we score it to anonymously put your marks in, if that's okay. So yeah, stay logged into Socrative if you like, and we'll set it up for later on. All right, I'll see you in about 10 minutes.